They are interpreted, except for the ColdFusion specific tags, they're just output directly out to the response. And the ColdFusion tags are evaluated, and that's how it works. Components usually contain usable functions that other people can incorporate into it, and you can call component functions from other pages or other components. And it's basically just a way to reuse code through an application. Functions, or AKA UDFs, user-defined functions, it's a traditional function. You can call them remotely. One interesting thing about these about functions is that as of, I don't know when it started. I think it was around CF6 or CF7. Functions, they allow the ability for functions to be called externally if there's an access modifier you specify in the CF function tag. And if that's specified, then you can invoke any function with arbitrary arguments derived directly from the request string from anywhere, as long as you can access it, as long as the web server lets you through, if you've specified that as public. A lot of people use this, and it was designed to implement web services pretty easily, really simple, quick and dirty things. But there's no authentication directly built in, so a lot of people end up rolling their own. That's one thing to watch out for. I'll talk a little bit about the kind of the internal workings of the life cycle of the request, which is all of the stages that it goes through and kind of what happens at each stage. When you request a page, say foo.cfm, it actually looks, before it actually runs that, it looks for one of two files. One of them is application.cfc or application.cfm. And that's basically if you want to run code that is going to be run before any given page, any given request, that stuff gets loaded. So if you want to have setup stuff that's common to the rest of an application, that's where you put it. And application.cfm is a page. It's simple. It just runs before everything, and that's pretty much it. Application.cfc lets you define certain entry points. I don't know if that's on this slide or not. But basically, you can say, when the request starts, run this code. You can have separate functions for these. When a session starts, when the application starts, when the server starts, you can have it run separate things for that. So it gives you developers a little bit more flexibility in terms of what they're doing. And here's a list of those. One of them at the end is on error, and when an internal ColdFusion exception occurs, and it's not being caught, and there's no explicit error handling in the form of a CF error tag, this function is called if it exists. And if it doesn't, then it goes to a default error page. Pages can include other pages. There are a few different ways to do this. One of them is to use a tag called cfinclude, and that one, the difference between that and the other another option, which is calling it as a custom tag, which is you literally prefix the name of the file modulos.cfm with cf underscore, and you call it like that. So if you can see cf underscore foo, you just write that in your code, and it looks for a file called foo.cfm and runs it. Yeah. Oh, and there's like I was talking, or like Chris was mentioning earlier, there are tags for interacting with a lot of stuff. Like, you want to run LDAP queries? Well, ColdFusion can make that happen. Do you want to talk to a Flash applet or a Flash application? You can definitely do that. There are lots of ways to do that. Sending mail, FTPing, pretty much anything you can imagine that that was common when ColdFusion was started is in there, as well as stuff that's been added over the years. So they've added a lot to it. Okay, so now I guess we're getting into the language of, or more of the semantics of the actual language. And it's, ColdFusion has variables, and ColdFusion has variables, big surprise. They are dynamically scoped and dynamically typed. in documentation, you'll see referred to as scopes. And that's slightly confusing if you're in a kind of very explicit anal retentive programming language design sense, because they're not really scopes, but they are. So anyway, you can explicitly, so when you refer to a variable, when you reference a variable within, say, a tag that's directed to output it, which is CF output, or in other tags which you can use variables in. And that's, by the way, that's the syntax for interpolating a variable. You don't have to explicitly refer to a variable within its given scope. In the case of the top one, there's no scope preceding it. And the one at the bottom, it's looking in the URL scope. And the URL scope is get variables, essentially. That's where if you want to explicitly refer to a get variable, you use url.foo. Now, if you don't use qualified variable, or if you don't use fully qualified variables, if you just use variables named foo or I or x, being able to tell exactly what you're going to get just by looking at it can be kind of tricky. You kind of have to know, for example, in the case of CF query, it imports, if you select rows from a database, the names of the result rows, those names get imported into the local variable scope, and you can just refer to them through there. And there's no real explicit place for this other than in the query. And this even happens in the case of some stored procedures on some platforms. So you can basically just get random variables in code, and unless you're familiar with the underlying workings of it, it can be hard to tell what the developer was intending. So here's a list of all of the different variable scopes. And I'm not going to go through all of these. There's the typical ones are here. A way to get variables, where to get the post variables, cookies, files. There's session data, which you can read and write to. There's application data. There's request, which is not like request in PHP. It's designed, it's designed for local storage over the lifetime of an entire request. So if you have a whole mess of pages calling each other and components and all sorts of stuff, and you need to share data between them, that's a really easy and pretty lazy way to do it. So it gets used for that a lot. In addition to session, there's also client scoping. The client scope, which it's also keyed to a given client, given HTTP client by a cookie. But also sometimes the data can be stored in the cookie as well. It's sort of similar to it's not really similar to ASP.NET form type, but basically sometimes it can be. The data is in the client scope is supplied by the client itself, by the HTTP client, and sometimes it's stored on the server. So it's not like session data explicitly. As I mentioned earlier, CF is dynamically typed and it's weakly typed. The variable type system really hasn't changed since it was designed to be easy in the 90s, and it's pretty common to see implicit conversions from different types all over the place. And you don't really even think about types in general when you're writing ColdFusion, unless you're dealing with something like a query or an array or a file, or a few other similar things, and I'll go over some of those later. Pretty much everything, you just use it and it works. And the way it works under the covers is there are a lot of implicit conversions that say, well, you're calling a function or a tag that needs a number. Okay, if a variable you pass in is a string, it's going to implicitly try to convert it to a number, and if it works, great. If not, well, then it'll throw an exception and something will happen. Some of the types that aren't like this are the opaque types, which are which are like queries, files, or yeah, HTTP queries, LDAP queries, files, all sorts of other things. And the way these work is they look like variables, except you can access them like structures. Like, say, you have a file named X, you can use X, or a query result named X, you can use X dot column1 or whatever to access the name of them. And instead of, and obviously, like, this isn't always great for developers, and they need to have their own enforcement of type checking. And the way that usually works is there are two ways this is kind of built into the language. One of them is through the tag named cfparam, and that basically says, I'm explicitly declaring a variable, which isn't necessary at all, and and you can optionally say, I want it to be of this type. And what they mean by type isn't necessarily like there's an underlying language type. It means that can this be converted to it, which is fine. So if you say, I want it to be of type telephone, it'll try to parse that as a US NANPA phone number, so like 10 digits optionally formatted with dashes. And if it doesn't, then it throws an exception. And they have all sorts of things for this. There's a Boolean one, there's a credit card one, there's various date ones, times. There's a social security number one. Basically just to make it as easy as possible for people to just input whatever and not have to think too hard about things. Although a lot of those tags done by cfparam and cfargument work like that, there are some that do explicitly check for types, and those are array, query, struct, and string, which is basically anything that's not one of those. Well, it can be converted to a string. And the difference between cfparam and cfargument is that cfparam effectively refers to a given variable binding at a given point in time and says, this has to be this, and cfargument checks it as an argument to a function. As I mentioned earlier, this is how you interpolate data. A lot of you probably know a lot about how this works. It's pretty simple. If you've ever written a dynamic application, you've dealt with stuff like this. ColdFusion does have some pretty interesting features. There's eval. There's two different forms of eval. There's a double IF, which is kind of similar. It's a conditional evaluation or conditional delayed evaluation. And it also lets you define, in an assignment, you can say, well, the variable name to be assigned to is also dynamically specified. I guess I'll turn it over to Chris for some more.
OK, so we're going to start going through things that you would do as a developer or a code reviewer or a pen tester if you're looking at one of these applications and you want to find stuff that's wrong with it. So the first thing you have to understand, usually when you're looking for typical web application vulnerabilities, is where does the untrusted data come from, right? Because usually you're looking for untrusted data, you're following it through the program and looking for it to be used in a dangerous way, whether that's a SQL query or printing something out to a page or going into some API that's dangerous. But you have to start by understanding where the data comes from. So one thing you can do is you can look for data by scopes. We had the list of scopes earlier, so URL,